You know what we could do is do you remember that old TV show that Leonard Nimoy hosted, In Search Of?
Mm-hmm.
That show was a show I almost exclusively saw when we were on road trips to visit family in other states, because we'd pull up and it wouldn't be time to go to dinner yet, but we'd turn the TV on, and that was something that would always be inoffensive. And so there'd be Leonard Nimoy talking about Sasquatch or something.
I still, I remember the Amityville Horror House one.
Yeah. So we could call this In Search Of.
In Search of a Topic?
Yeah.
Yeah, boy!
Oh, smile.
Okay, here we go. You ready? Silence!
I can't name, outside of this very, limited frame of time of like mid 80s to mid 90s, not even that late in some ways. Is it a genre that is still viable? Has it been replaced by other genres? What are those genres? Why?
Yeah. Is it just pieces, parts, and other stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, and according to the Wikipedia thing, it's like, without the strength of its figureheads, EBM as a discernible music style faded by the mid-90s. In the late 90s and after the millennium, Belgian, Swedish, and German artists such as Ionic Vision, Tiskelude, and Spetsnaz had reactivated the style. Okay. Based on this revival, Sweden and East Germany then became the center of the movement, spawning a variety of newcomers such as DuPont, Proceed, and Sequence E. Primarily as a counteracting force against the expanding future pop scene, these artists followed a neo-traditionalistic path often referred to as old school EBM. Simultaneously, a number of European techno producers started incorporating elements of EBM into their sound. This tendency grew in parallel with the emerging electroclash scene. And as that scene started to decline, artists partly associated with it, such as The Hacker, DJ Hell, Green Velvet, Black Strobe, and David Coretta, moved towards this techno EBM crossover style. There has been increasing convergence between this scene and the old school EBM scene. Some artists have remixed each other. Most notably, Terence Fixmer joined with Nitzer Ebbs, Douglas McCarthy to form Fixmer McCarthy. Yeah, but Fixmer McCarthy's been around a long time.
So is part of the issue, I don't know, I feel like as I was listening to all this stuff, and a bunch of this stuff I had listened to a bunch in the past, and I never really sectioned it off so precisely, and maybe is that part of the conundrum?
Could be,
for lack of whereas so we went down that synthwave and vaporwave, and then we mentioned a couple other genres, but there was discernible difference between everything we were talking about, and the bleed over was a little more in aesthetic and obviously maybe instrumentation, but otherwise they were distinct enough that we could have that conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't know, is EBM, you start EBM, electroclash, industrial metal, industrial, some of these live, flashing back to the Skinny Puppy episode. I mean, one of the videos I was watching ties Skinny Puppy to some of this, but also they're tied to a million things, and you've got
right. Well, and
I don't know.
Bites and Remission is pretty different than everything else, and a lot closer to some of this than yeah.
But is it almost like this is more of a symptom of trying to get so nuanced with genre descriptions, and I don't know where, just because, again, it seems like somebody said something in an interview or whatever,
right?
Stuff.
Well,
again,
so
kind of a
So I think the episode has started. So let's we'll introduce it later, right? Later. Yeah, right. Exactly. So, all right. One of the most important pieces of this conversation, I think, is the fact that quote unquote industrial music has never set easily with most of the people we associate with the genre. That's not something that they associated with it necessarily, but that's because a lot of the people who are like in the genre in the early stages of what we think of it, you and I, and probably most of our age group peers, actually know about industrial records, which is where Chris and Cozy and Throbbing Gristle and these bands that are sort of spiritual forebears and the DNA of some of the kind of experimentation that's happening that is part of this electronic but also art related music scene. They're on industrial records, and so that gets called industrial music because of the label. And then it also so happens that some of those people, while doing electronic music in its earliest forms, are also pounding on steel plates and recording under overpasses, and then get associated with bands like Einstürzende Neubauten, who are kind of the poster boys for the word industrial that actually means like using power tools and whatever else. So like genre has been a problem for all of these groups, I think, one way or another, because either they say something in some offhand remark in an interview or something that gets recorded and somebody runs with it.
Yeah.
Which is what it sounds like happened with Kraftwerk coining the phrase electronic body music way early on. And then other people who are fans and influenced by these bands pick up on that sense of, well, that works for me. That's what I want to do. That's how I want to be associated. So like DAF starts calling their music corpus music, which or whatever, it's something close to that, corpse music maybe, but that's like this German word for body music.
Right.
And then a few more years later, someone that they influenced is Front 242, and in an interview in some magazine, they say, oh, our music is electronic body music, almost as a way not to be associated with this term industrial that nobody really feels comfortable or good about, because they're not on that label and they're not Neubauten and they are electronic. So, well, what is this thing that we're doing and how is it different and why is it not that? And then you get that whole artist thing, like, I'm not part of a genre, we're doing our own new thing.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I was going to say. Like, I think to the general public, like, so it's human nature a bit to try to categorize something, right, especially when you're trying to describe it to somebody, obviously, and
right.
I think this is a genre that has industrial, EBM, all of those, goth, I think all of those partially are based in a we're not part of the system, we're not part of the establishment mentality,
right,
is somewhat
right,
baked into lyrics or musical styles or musical choices or all that stuff. So it by default creates some kind of confusion or
right,
disconnection there. Like, I think some of the terms we've run into are like we've noticed are literally made off the cuff because they're just trying to come up with some different word, or
right,
a lot of bands feeling like they're the only, like, the genre is, well, this is just our band, like, whereas rock music or pop music or some of those, like, that the genre part of it is not concerning to them at all.
Yeah.
I don't think they're getting bent out of shape about metal versus rock, or
Well, I think
a little
I think
bit maybe, but
the 80s and 90s, though, there was, okay, like the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, like the era where you and I are like coming into our own as, you know, young adults who understand the music that we like and why we're seeking it out.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of this. I don't know if it's a pretension. I don't know if it's just a symptom of the time, but none of those grunge bands wanted to be called grunge.
yeah,
Right? There was that same kind of pushback that, you know, grunge, what does that even mean? You know, why is this happening? Whatever. And when the funk metal kind of thing, when, you know, the Chili Peppers and Faith No More and whomever are starting to talk about, you know, where they fit, they're like, we play the music that we play and it's inspired by funk, but it's inspired by metal, and, you know, and so there's always this hedging and this don't classify us, don't genreify us. But music labels know that that's how they sell more of something, because the similarities are what are how people do music search. It's how people do music discovery.
I mean, that's how you, when you go into a record store, you go
Right.
to a
You
particular
can put
section.
every artist ever in alphabetical order. Fuck
Right.
that. Can you imagine? Either you only carry certain labels, or I mean, you would almost be better off putting bands in alphabetical order within their label and just say, here's all the Geffen records, here's all the Sony records, here's all the Warner
But even
Brothers
that,
records.
like we've already touched on that before.
Well, yeah, who the
if
hell
you're
owns
looking
what
for
when?
Sarah McLachlan, like,
Yeah.
you know,
Right. Well, but at the very least, if I went to all the network stuff, you know, there she is, weird, but okay. And then
Yeah.
there's all this other stuff. But we don't. It's interesting too the way certain genres like really, really get hung up on the label that produces stuff, and other genres don't. I think rap has very much sort of this kind of notion of, you know, what label something is on matters. Punk had it too, and a lot of this is, again, that fringy difference from the mainstream. You know, American records can put out pretty much anything that Rick Rubin thinks is cool, right? Like
Right.
anything Rick Rubin wants to put out, it'll go on American or Deaf American or whatever it was called at the time. But and Geffen for a while there kind of had this sort of vibe to what they were doing. But the big majors, they're trying to encapsulate and absorb and pull into the fold all of these different things. But you know kind of what you're going to get if you listen to 4AD. You know kind of what you're going to get if you listen to Sub Pop. You know kind of what you're going to get if you listen to a bunch of those California pop punk, you know, labels, Lookout Records or Cruise or any of those, you know.
Well, so I wonder if part of this, and this would take some research, and, you know, like, because I'm trying to think of, there was a bunch of labels around that time that I think fall into what you're saying, you know, they like TVT and Interscope and like, and all this stuff.
Right.
But part of that was also the major labels owning those smaller things, and unless you knew that smaller thing was owned by the bigger thing, like, to your point, like, I think the label became a way to encapsulate a certain type of music, or give it that, you know, define it as being more indie or underground or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
I wonder what impact that has on all this too, where we're talking about there's a bazillion genres around, floating around EBM,
Right.
but I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, but you know what I mean? Like, I think the label part of it, because I think that part of it is now, outside of a few of those that you mentioned, like hip hop and maybe some other things, the label is less important. Like, I think we were part of a time when you would actually, you took pride in, because you listened to stuff on Sub Pop, or you listened to stuff on, you know, you would actually, that's the reason that we know the names of those labels even, is partially because that somehow signified you were listening to something cool.
Right. Well, so okay, and 4AD is still a thing, but they've had to grow and change and evolve over time, especially as some of their artists have moved on to other things or whatever. But then you see where like Metropolis Records pops up and kind of starts to absorb everybody who is either disillusioned with their current label or anybody who gets dropped from a major. There's this kind of, I don't know, it's a place where industrial bands sort of go to live out the rest of their career. They can end up on Metropolis,
Yeah.
will put their stuff out. There's a known entity kind of element to that. You don't have to guess. And I think some of the things that Network did wrong as a label that alienated a bunch of the bands whose artwork they still own and are, there's some contention with Skinny Puppy and things like that. But Skinny Puppy ending up on a major and like floating around out there for a while and then finally settling at Metropolis. And then there's the sort of what's the name of Kevin Key's personal imprint label? Subconscious.
Oh yeah. During that time period, I wouldn't have been like, oh my God, Front 242's touring with Skinny Puppy. Like you wouldn't go, those two bands are so different. Why would they
no.
You know what I mean?
Not
Like,
at all.
or like that all kind of fit.
It would have been like, holy shit, awesome,
bucket,
let's go.
right.
Yeah.
But I think to them, they didn't want to be, I don't think the bands were like fighting with each other or anything.
No.
But I mean, there was such a weird necessity to not be pigeonholed into certain things. But I don't even really know that I totally understand the reason.
Well, I wonder too a little bit if, well, okay, so if we look at what was also happening, so Pigface gets started. God, the history of that band is so goofy because basically Ministry does Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, and then they get all of these people they think are cool to tour with them. So they've got Martin Atkins, who had been in Killing Joke and PIL. They've got Ogre singing with them. They've got Trent Reznor doing some stuff with them.
Yeah, like Chris Connolly was.
Chris Connolly's on the album. So Ministry is like done with that. They finished that tour. They're, about to be picked up for a much bigger release with Psalm 69. And all those other guys are like, hey, this is working out pretty cool. Let's keep going. And Martin Atkins is like, all right, let's go. And so in one sense, you've got Wax Trax and all of the kind of stuff that's circling that, and this kind of emerging industrial metal-y kind of thing happening. And at the same time, you've got all these people saying, well, don't throw us in that genre. So you don't see anybody from those more techno-y, EBM-ish bands in that crew touring with those guys. Part of that collaboration, that's not happening the same way. I thought about it somewhat, maybe more because I was newer to these musical genres than probably you were, just given the difference in our age. And I think I don't
know though, because I was in Bowling Green before I started
okay
venturing down, and you had heard Skinny Puppy before I had heard Skinny
Okay.
Puppy.
Okay.
So
Well,
yeah,
and-
I think it was maybe more just I was hearing all of this stuff at the same time. So maybe that's
okay,
where I
okay.
just pieced it all together. You know, getting within a year of getting introduced to Skinny Puppy, I'd also been introduced to KMFDM and to Front
Right,
242
okay.
and to
Right.
finding these nuanced CDs and you know all these other, or trying to let me hear what you know. I remember Steve was way into Einstürzende Neubauten, you know, so like I kind of heard all those things within the same time period.
Okay.
So because of that, I guess I also didn't differentiate them. I just,
Yeah.
to me, it was much like an entire bigger envelope genre of stuff.
Okay, that makes some sense. Yeah, like in high school, I knew one guy, this guy Matt, who he had an older sister who I think even worked at the Wright State University radio station and turned him on to stuff. And so he, you know, gave me some mixtapes and things like that. And then my cousin lived in the Phoenix suburbs and every band in the world went through there. And so he was of an age where he just went to every concert that came by because he could.
Yeah.
And he liked a bunch of different music, but he liked it for the music and it was something to do. And it was part of sort of a scene, I guess he was in. Once I got to Bowling Green, though, I met Gordon, and that was significant.
Yeah.
that was significant. When I met Gordon, going to shows with Gordon or just talking about me, Gordon would talk about music with me, and he would mention 7 bands, and I would know 2.
Yeah.
And then I'd be like, well, what about this? And then I'd find something by one of those bands and I was like, what the hell? Why did Gordon mention this band? Like Test Department.
Okay.
He mentioned Test Department to me. I go find a Test Department album and it's a bunch of bagpipes. I'm like, what? This isn't what he was talking about. What's going on here?
Yeah.
But that's just because that band's very political, very different kind of thing. And they're all over the place. So, but the other piece of that was significant to me is that a lot of the punk that I got exposed to right at the end of high school and the beginning of college was through guys who were sort of tiptoeing around the edges of some really kind of fringe political stuff that was happening more like in the hardcore world. And so I knew some guys who were skinheads, but they weren't racist white power skinheads, but they were American pride skinheads. Well, so what does that mean? You know, like
Yeah.
their politics was what was their politics? What's going on there? And then, you know, you've got all of that hardcore stuff that has this political edge to it, and then you've got the straight edge stuff, and then you've got the people who become
Yeah.
Hare Krishnas because of straight edge and that whole thing. But then you've also got the ways in which some of the origins of that music is being used to recruit actual Nazi skinheads in the UK. And so I took a course my freshman year that I probably wasn't really prepared for called Totalitarianism and Thought Control. It was an honors seminar. And I went to see the Too Dark Park tour with Gordon. And I had made a road trip to Michigan to see these skinhead guys I knew play a show in the middle of nowhere in this tiny little, you know, back room of a skate park or something. And I was associating all of this stuff I was studying with all of this music, and then I was digging into the roots of how subcultures and music cultures are co-opted by politics. And so I was really sensitive to album covers with fascist iconography because I was like, okay, this looks really Nazi-ish. Like, what the hell's going on here, you know? Or it looks pseudo-Soviet, or it looks Eastern Bloc, or it looks... And, you know, I didn't really understand Marxism or communism all that well, other than those are the bad guys, right? Oh, wait, they're not the bad guys anymore because they don't exist, because the wall came down. You know, it was a weird time for all of that. And so then you have these, like, the first time I hear harsh critiques of the United States that aren't coming from people inside the United States by French and Belgian and German, but not the bad Germans, the good Germans, you know,
Yeah.
like that it was hard. It was confusing as a
Yeah.
kid to get my head around it.
Do you think any of it was? I mean, I think Martin Atkins is British, right?
He's
And
British.
Chris Connolly is.
He's British, too,
He's
yeah.
Irish or something.
Ogre's
But-
Canadian.
But like otherwise, the EBM Belgium.
Yeah, it's all
Germany,
those
but, like,
Belgian and French and German guys.
yeah, like
There's a difference.
there's a weird cultural divide for no reason,
Sure.
kind of like. But well, or like why like Wax Tracks was heavily
Chicago based.
Chicago, heavily
Yeah,
U.S. kind of like.
Right. And yeah, it seems like what we think of as straight up, industrial or whatever is like Wax Tracks and TVT because of Nine Inch Nails, and Network, very much these North American entities.
But you know what I mean? Like there's something to the EBM stuff that also, by it being rooted in German, like it's got that, you've got your
Yeah, it's
Liebox and
European.
your
Yeah,
like, but there's a very different vibe you get, even if it's just the language.
right.
You get a very different vibe from hearing, even though KMFDM is really kind of on the other side.
Yeah,
but like-
KMFDM is weird, but they're on Wax Tracks. Yeah.
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 But there's something to hearing that type of music with German lyrics that
yeah.
has a different feel, or that sort of the aggression comes through different, and
Yeah.
if it's just historically based or whatever, I don't know, like, it just, I don't know. It feels like some of that EBM stuff has some influence in another musical type, whereas I mean, you're not really saying like industrial music or industrial metal and some of those things. Like there's enough of a tie by using guitars and stuff that there's some connection to
Right.
American rock music,
Right.
whereas this EBM stuff, whether on purpose, it's not coming from, like, it almost feels like it's coming from some kind of traditional music, or maybe
Right.
not classical, but does that make sense? Like it's
Yeah.
pulling, I mean, it's clearly just boom, ching, like there's
Yeah.
really
Well,
just beats,
so okay.
but the melodies that go in there feel very European, very
So
German, or
all right, we've danced around some of this, right? And we've talked about punk, but I would offer that perhaps, especially when you look at something like Neubauten and what they were trying to do and their sort of art movement thing, that is a literal post-apocalyptic landscape in a way that the United States has never experienced.
Yeah.
Both of the world wars were fought on their soil in their countries. And while, there was never a big Axis invasion of the UK, there was at least bombings and raids and stuff over England.
Yeah.
And so that's not something, I mean, that's part of the big shock of 9/11 for the United States, that the closest we've had to anything like that up until 9/11 was Pearl Harbor. And that's like this island territory way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at the time. It wasn't
Right.
even a state yet, right? So you've got punk in England being this very different thing that's a reaction to earlier punk in New York. And as that gets to this place where, there's still the Iron Curtain, there's still the wall, there's still a different sort of fallout from American and British economics, when you see Neubauten and those guys have shaved heads and spiky hair and long black trench coats and combat boots and are walking through sort of a bunch of what look like bombed out buildings, that's different than,
Yeah.
suburbia. that movie that Flea
Yeah,
is
yeah.
in. You know, like there's an American sense of a moral and ethical wasteland in the 80s, but there's still some real wasteland locations in parts of Europe that are, you know, pieces of their culture, and then this kind of chanty, slogany, shouty sort of thing.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what I mean. Like, yeah, it's rooted in something very different than
and tribal,
and
but
even though it's anti-establishment but what
Right.
the establishment is a very different thing, and
Right.
it's more anti-fascist, anti like all these other things that maybe music going forward in America will
Right.
start to pick up more of those flavors, but that's a different
right.
topic.
Well, it's like Sid Vicious walking around with a swastika on his T-shirt in the UK was not because he was I don't know if he was a racist or not. It doesn't really matter.
Right.
That's not the point of that. The point of it is, like, you know, this F you to mainstream people, like, how dare you? Because I dare. You know, that's why, you know, fuck you and your mother. But when all of these sort of up and coming, once world powers becoming them again kind of places that used to be imperialist, you know, the Belgians owned a bunch of Africa at one point in their own mind, and were harsh and terrible to the people of the Congo. And the French, you know, big chunks of North America and Asia were controlled by and North Africa were controlled by the French.
Yeah.
And as they've lost that, but it's being replaced with this very American influenced bourgeois middle class consumerism. One of the best ways that you can, like, thumb your nose at this moderate, middle of the road, kind of kinder, gentler government is to dress like a fascist, but talk like a radical. And that's kind of what those guys did. You know, they're putting on combat boots and fatigues, and, you know, they're chanting slogans that sound like they could come from like a Nazi march. Especially like Nights of Ebb. Like, I didn't know what to think of that band because all of their album covers look like something right out of a fascist playbook, you know?
Right.
But that's kind of their point. Is, like, you know, they're pushing back against those things in these other ways.
Yeah. So I wonder. So again, I think to tie it back to EBM, then I think that's I think maybe at the beginning of talking about this, you know, I struggled with the differentiation between, because in my head all this music has some connection enough that I listen to it because of a certain aesthetic and things, but I think in the end it's more about where it's rooted in and what it's, you know, I didn't like these bands because of their album cover or because of the fashion choices, but because of the sound of the music.
Right. And
there's something to just a lot of the same instrumentation, but then when you get in the weeds of it, you've got that, like you're saying, like a Nights of Ebb or Frontier, like those are all maybe have some roots in a punk mentality, but in a Eastern European kind of framework. And then we've got like the Skinny Puppy stuff is dark and moody and anti things, but more anti things that we deal with over here in the Western Hemisphere, and animal rights and human, like, and at a high level at their core, it's hard, aggressive electronic music rooted in some kind of somewhat political, somewhat thought-provoking stuff, but it's also very different.
Right.
In the end, and it's, you know, but I don't, up until now, I mean, I don't know that I even sat and really thought that much about that, you know, like. So I wonder, this comes from watching that one video that I shot you. because there seems to be a connection between EBM, the start of EBM, and some of those groups, and like punk music.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
but purposefully not having a drummer and a bass player and a guitarist, and then but being gritty and driving and
Right.
rebellious and all the other parts of punk. And then really as you drift back into, because then part of, where we're looking of like, where did it go? A lot of those core bands drifted more, the guitars came back in, or
Right. Right.
and I wonder, I guess I wonder why, but also, or why does that make it that different? For me, I'm hugely politically naive, probably still now. I'm way more naive than I should be, but I would look at stuff like that and I think mentally equate it the same as, I'm looking over my shoulder and like the skull on a Danzig album, or the controversial Guns N' Roses cover, or whatever. So I just took anything controversial in a giant bucket of like, that may be something I am drawn to in the band because they've are edgy in some way or something.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Edgy was
that's
the word.
That's not why I
Yeah.
was seeking that stuff out. But I mean, like, I wouldn't have thought twice about. I would have thought twice about a bunch of swastikas all over an album cover.
Right.
I don't want to. It wasn't that far, but I didn't look at like some of these EBM bands with that just sort of, it's an artistic choice of style, and looked at it and gone, to me that was no different than, an album that's got a bunch of skeletons on it, or that's got a bunch of whatever. Like, I don't know. Does that make sense? It just fell into sort of a generic bucket of like, okay, this isn't a picture of the members of the band with some spotlights on them. It's something different or a little whatever. Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I don't, and that's neither good nor bad. I don't know. I mean, I also didn't put a whole lot of this. Again, it's been a while since we mentioned it. It ties back to, I think I also wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to the lyrics. So they could have been singing about horrible stuff. And it may have gone over my head. So.
Right. You ever listen to Age of Chance?
That does not ring a bell at all. Age of Chance.
They covered Kiss by Prince.
Okay.
It's worth finding. Age of Chance, Kiss. Like, go, it's awesome and ridiculous. And the guy who turned me on to that, ironically, was one of those skinhead kids. And it's a total dance track, a techno version.
Yeah.
It's not quite By God 20 does Madonna, but it's not a far cry from it. And so I'm going to share my screen with you here. Yeah, there we go. And the album cover of the very first thing I ever saw by them is that.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is screaming to me something Eastern Bloc.
Yeah.
But then it's this dance song and they're covering Prince, and it's like, what the hell?
Yeah.
But there's, and I don't think Age of Chance is necessarily EBM. I'm not saying that, but they're not, a far cry. They're at least, cousins.
Yeah.
And then the first couple of Nitzer Ebb. Okay, so I looked it up, and like the first pronunciation in Wikipedia is Nitzer, and I think
I flip flop all the time.
Yeah, I think the guy said Nitzer on stage. Yeah, somebody said Nitzer in Cleveland when we went to that show, but I don't know for sure. But again, like the iconography for all of their stuff starts off with these just two tones, these very graphic design sort of, there's a gear and some Helvetica font. there's very minimalist sorts of stuff that feels very, at first, like that Total Age, holy crap.
Right.
There's a hammer, there's a gear, there's a star. It's Soviet. What do you want? But then it gets away from that and much more into this kind of product, this commodification kind of advertising thing. But there's some scary eagle-ish bird, like.
I remember not knowing what to make of the early, because I think the first two KMFDM albums I heard was UAIOE and what's the one right before it? Is it Don't Blow Your Top or is that just the song? But that like harsh.
Oh yeah.
Do a like couple tritone colors and just like a dude's. Like I didn't know what to make of those album covers.
Right.
Or those ones jump out.
Yeah, absolutely. Just all of this stuff from them.
But UAIOE was
and
the
Naive
first one that I had.
Too. Yeah, that's the first one I had too. And it's such a weird thing because there's like reggae songs on there too,
Yeah. No, it's totally, I didn't know. Yeah.
And again, another band that covered Madonna. Like,
yeah,
sort of.
It's weird now looking back and talking to, like, I just didn't put a lot of thought into, like, I mean, I remember thinking it was cool that there was a reggae-ish kind of song on there, but it didn't really, I was like, cool.
It just confused me. I just didn't know what I was like, wait, what is this song? But reggae was part of the counterculture that I didn't fully get into. I was, I didn't smoke weed. I wasn't a hippie. I only knew a few hippies, and I associated hippies with the Dead and reggae, and because of the whole weed connection. And I knew who Bob Marley was. I didn't know a ton of other reggae music. The thing that actually kind of gave me a better insight into reggae was ska. Once I understood that ska wasn't British and it was actually Jamaican and it actually predated reggae.
Yeah.
But like, Blondie doing The Tide Is High and learning that was a ska cover was like, oh crap. I just these little weird things. But yeah, there's one of those weird connection things like that went away for a while in the 80s. And I'll try to bring this back around. But so in the 70s, you've got punk, and punk is coexisting with all this other stuff in New York and in London and wherever it's happening. And so you've got Blondie doing a rap song, but they were considered a punk band, but they released a cover of a ska song. And so they were just doing their thing. They were just like part of this whole eclectic mix of weirdness that was outside of the mainstream. And then that becomes, in some ways, what appears to be in the 80s at the very least, this big no-no. That no, we're our thing. We're each of our things is our thing. And I don't know if that's just a perception that I have or if it's something that became the way that things were marketed.
So I was going to say, do you think it's, I mean, if you look at, right, if you take music up to that point and then now you've got MTV, now you've got marketing, now you've got bands coming out whose goal is we're going to sound this way because this is what's hot, or we're going to do this thing, or we're going to and that's probably where you really get the beginning of even some of these genre conversations and why the word genre even matters. Because before then, everything was either rock and roll or it's not like in the 30s people were saying big band and swing
Right.
as like I there was probably the words existed to define a little bit
I
of
think
something,
swing and
but,
jazz were being used,
but not in the
as-
same way. Like
well
we're-
as opposed
having
to
a genre like now, again, the root of what we're talking about is there's so many
yeah
nuanced descriptions to try
Right.
to capture what these four bands fit in that don't fit with other things, even though they, to the
Right,
average Joe,
right.
sound exactly, like, but I think I think that's probably a key point in time is really MTV and
right
how
we
it
package this and
coincided
sell
with
it.
radio and music magazine popular, like the whole engine. But
Right.
MTV was kind of like that. I think that missing piece that then gave radio more power and music interest out of publications and stuff more power.
Right.
And now you've got this thing, because up until then, because really the other thing, if you think about it, radio's huge. Radio has a huge influence on popular music and shaping and crafting it, in the Beatles
Right.
and Elvis
Right.
and everything. But it was still in some level local to some degree,
Right.
because at that point you still don't have the
You don't have
know,
Clear Channel
9,000,
yeah,
right? The radio stations everywhere are controlled by one place.
Right.
MTV though, that's your one stop, for a
Right.
while. VH1 eventually pops up, but that's
Which
not
is
really-
owned by them.
right.
Right.
So there's a stretch there where that is a single unifying spot where everyone's eyeballs are on what is hip, what is popular, what is going on.
Right.
And even though on MTV they're starting to, when they first start, they're playing a little bit of everything, but it's really driving what is the Billboard charts and the
Right.
pop music. And then eventually it starts to, you start to get your Yo MTV Raps and your different things. Then they
Right.
kind of branch off.
And then your
But it
multiple
was
MTVs
never-
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? It was unlike radio in that regard, that it was across the country and or outside of
Right.
the country.
Right.
Like you have Much Music in Canada and a couple other things elsewhere, but
Right. It's one of the things that strikes me as something that at the time seemed like this sort of controversial statement, or this kind of, is this a pose? Is this a posture? What is this? But it also goes along with that, bands don't want to be part of the genre that's like the flavor of the month or of the year or whatever.
Right.
And so when Kurt Cobain said that basically he thought Nirvana was a pop band, and like people just lost their shit all over that, because what does he mean? And is he trying to distance himself? And like it didn't last long. It wasn't that big a deal, but it always stuck with me because I tried to get my head around what he was saying, and he made some good points. But pop had come to be this bad word for people who had, haircuts like yours and mine. They, not now, then. But pop had become this thing you could build, you could make, you could structure, you could frame.
yeah.
What does a pop song has? It has this, and this. This is where it goes. And I think a lot of bands, in hindsight, there were a lot of bands that were maligned because they were doing well on like pop charts. But when I listen to them now, it's like, oh, wow, that band has a really great, rhythm section. Or I didn't believe that guy was such a
Right.
great guitarist. But then, like there's just so many bands that were like one hit wonders or whatever, but they were lumped into this category because a producer said, I can make that song sell 1 million copies. We just have to produce it this way. So they did.
Yeah.
And then that's the one song anybody's ever heard, but it's not as cool as like the rest of their record. And I definitely see that there was at some point this moment where pop became more formula and didn't really mean just popular. And the 80s kind of made that happen for that moment in a way that,
And
well, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think even it's really the late '80s.
Yes,
And that's again where
that's
I
just
think
what it
I think there's probably a whole podcast in this, like, of just what MTV really did for the musical landscape. Because if you think about what MTV was in the early '80s and those bands and what pop music was, and I think it's not what you're describing, but by the late '80s, where
Yeah.
I mean, the whole hair metal thing is like,
right.
it's a formula. It became a formula.
Absolutely.
And you had people that were just starting out and learning instruments when they're 14 and 15 and 16, when MTV is just starting. And it clearly there's enough people that it was guiding what, now they're 22 and their band is, and it's the late '80s, and I don't know, I mean, like,
Right. Yeah, totally.
and then so you clearly have a bunch of outside of that established format music going on.
Right.
But I think you're right. The term pop music was no longer about what was a hit on MTV or what.
Yeah, it was a way to get a hit on MTV.
Yeah.
It was a formula or a an approach.
And then MTV splintered apart into all these things. And I mean, I actually, I wonder, do you have like what your connection or affinity is for things like TRL and stuff like that?
That's
only because, so I don't know, I was just drifting out of being really dialed into MTV at that point. Like by the time, like the 90s music stuff for me with that is very different because I was just completely disconnected from all that. At that point.
Me too.
I didn't know I know we're like, not that far off in age. So, but
so I had access to cable television during college through friends or the dorm and the lounge. So it was hit or miss. If I was at somebody's house and videos were playing, okay. Then when I got out of college and I moved to North Carolina, for the first 2 years, I had terrestrial TV, and I was lucky to get all three of the major networks and Fox. I think like one of those networks was staticky no matter what I did, unless I was touching the antenna the whole time. It was bad. So then I got MTV again, but by then it was like 97 or so.
Okay.
And
it was probably half reality shows or more.
Well, there was definitely Real World. There's a lot of Real World. And then occasionally, there'd be like some countdown thing. There was still 120 minutes, things like that were still on. But by then, VH1 had completely changed their entire format and was now the one to watch because all of that behind the music stuff was happening. So half the time I was watching the stories of the bands that were popular in my high school and college days on Behind the Music. So VH1 was no longer like Barbara Streisand and Helen Reddy and, that kind of, Kenny G. It wasn't that anymore. It was definitely this different thing. And so as MTV was aiming itself still squarely at the 18 to 21 year old, 15 to 21 year old kind of range, VH1 was, now 25-year-olds and to 35-year-olds. And so it was this different sort of vibe, but it wasn't, it wasn't your parents' VH1 anymore. And so that I watched a lot more VH1 than I ever thought I would have by the time I was, 25, 26, 27 years old, because it was doing different stuff. It was a different kind of channel.
Yeah.
Once I got to graduate school, again, I didn't have cable TV for a couple of years. And when it came back around, it was like the early aughts. It was like 2001, 2002. And it was almost like this brand new, like, oh, wow, what's this? And because I saw a Michelle Branch video and I was like, who the hell is this kid? you know, because she was a teenager, and
Right.
I knew who Britney Spears was, but I had never seen a Christina Aguilera anything, and Genie in the Bottle kept being brought up in conversations as I was starting grad school, and I had no idea what the hell that song was, because I wasn't listening to those radio stations and I didn't have MTV at the time. And then I guess it was MTV2 or Much Music was on some cable offering.
Yeah, I remember having Much Music.
Yeah, and it
some
was like,
points.
okay, this is what I want to watch, because now, like, first time I ever heard Linkin Park, first time I ever heard, oh my god, the guys who do Dig, with the painted faces, Mudvayne.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the first time I heard either of those bands, or not Blink 182, but Sum 41, it was on Much Music or MTV2. And I was like, okay, this isn't, because this isn't what I understood new metal to be because of Limp Bizkit and some of that other stuff. But it's got these punk pieces and these hip hoppy pieces, and you know what's happening with this stuff. Yeah, that was one of the hardest things to come back to the United States and realize that there were no videos on MTV in the United States.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell is happening here? That was so weird, because, you know, I went to Japan in 2006. I came back in 2011, and I was like, what the hell? This is literally all reality TV shows. It's a whole lot of Jersey Shore, and what is going on here? And in Japan, they have their own version of MTV called Space Shower TV, but they also have MTV, and both of those play music a lot, you know, or did in the late aughts. So I watched a lot of Japanese MTV because it was a bunch of cool Japanese music I hadn't heard of, and sometimes very fringy Japanese music, because it was the Japanese music I literally had not heard of that was on mainstream Japanese television all the time.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So let's see, to veer back toward where we started. I mean, so we've looked at the ways in which maybe the genre name is the problem, and that's why it doesn't seem like, you know, there's any EBM after a certain time, but also why a bunch of different bands kind of get lumped into it. And I can see a little bit of why parts of Pretty Hate Machine, somebody might have said, oh, that's EBM, because it sounds more like Front 242 or whomever than not. And on that first album, sure. But once you get to Broken, and especially once you get to the next full album by Nine Inch Nails,
Downward Spiral.
Yeah, like March of the Pigs isn't that anymore. You know, he's in fact doing things in the studio to almost make things sound less techno, more analog-ish.
Yeah.
You know, playing a drum kit and miking the drum kit so that it has that hollow played in a garage kind of sound sometimes. Making it clear that they are a band, even though it's him. Like, even the videos are like, here's 4 guys playing instruments in this sterile white room. He's dropping a microphone and you're hearing it thunk. You know, that's there's something to a lot of that about his reaction against, like, you're industrial or whatever. It's interesting hearing some of those guys, especially the ones who are like in their late 50s and 60s now, like for example, Al Jurgensen from Ministry, he'll now use the word industrial because it's too hard for him not to. And he's just like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll throw in so-called, and he's like, here we are in this genre or whatever. I saw an interview with him just recently where he explained why they got dropped after being on a major for a couple of releases. And he's like, we put out Psalm 69 and they wanted Psalm 70. And we weren't doing that. And he mentions in that same clip that he can say with some pride that no Ministry album really sounds like any other Ministry album. And that seems pretty accurate for the most part.
Yeah.
I mean, there are distinct moves made from album to album, even there when I wasn't listening to a lot of their releases. When I did, it was like, oh, okay, they're doing this now. But that labeling of those bands and the fact that they just fought against it. It seems like just even using the word EBM, the guys in Front 242 seem to have been making a move to simultaneously get some sort of bona fides, like, yeah, just like the guys in Kraftwerk said, we're electronic body music. So they're hearkening back to, our real roots in this German electronic music. But we're not this industrial thing that's Ministry and Skinny Puppy and all these other people that you're talking about. We're this. So they're carving out their little niche of like, we're telling you who our musical DNA is, but we're not like all these other people right now. We're not in this genre. We're a different genre that has its roots in this real, old electronic music. I don't know. The internet and the way distribution has changed, and the way that the CD imploded after MP3, and there's just, the industry is so different now. I guess that's kind of the overriding theme of this podcast in some ways, is like, we got into music at a time when there was a lot of cool music to get into, but it was a very, very different time. It was the beginning of how to kind of DIY yourself into something.
Yeah. But
we weren't quite there yet when we were trying to make our music. We were, the systems just weren't quite in place yet. The USB as a technology made such a big change in the cost effectiveness and ease of doing anything with music in your house,
Yeah.
Because fighting with SCSI and serial ports and all that other bullshit you had to have, and even FireWire was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't great.
Yeah.
For some of its weird limitations and things it would do that would kind of screw with things. But once USB was like set and going and ready and raring to go, and a default that was always present, that tied with MP3 technology and that sort of stuff, made a big difference. The internet as a utility instead of some kind of special thing you had to seek out made a big difference too. I don't know. Now we're down a tangent. Sorry.
No. And then I was about to go down even like another different.
Well, what were you going to go? Where were you going to go?
Well, because so it's, I don't know if there's an irony to it or just if it's just interesting or whatever, that like we're talking about, a lot of this music that we're talking about is electronic based.
Right.
Contrasted with the recording technology and everything was very analog. And, you have this battle between like even the stuff that we mucked around with, like to try to get some samples or to try to get some gear to work and so like, so that we could then get it into a 4-track that was recording on cassette, you know, like there's some dichotomy there of the rise of these tools and these synthesizers and this other stuff, whereas the technology to capture all that was not in the same place. I just think it's a little interesting. You know, like now we're talking about you can record all this stuff in your bedroom, and you know, so making electronic stuff that's literally coming from the same thing that's also capturing
right.
you know, I mean, it's a completely different.
Absolutely. And there's like the layer upon layer of that. I mean, if we really want to like either become very depressed or like blow our own minds or whatever, but I was thinking about how ironic, and I don't know if this is in a good way or a bad way, but like the fetishization of vinyl released by Skinny Puppy.
Yeah.
I mean, if we think about that for a minute, vinyl by this band, you know, that's not the ideal release format for that band, is it? You know, like, what is that the way you want to listen to all these synths and samples burping at each other with that, you know, distinctive, you know, warm tone skipping like buzz of vinyl? I don't know. I don't. It doesn't seem like it ought to be. It doesn't seem like, you know, the soundtrack to Neuromancer or the cyberpunk future of Dystopia it ought to be on a record. You know, that's just weird. But it's, I have a ton of Skinny Puppy stuff, and part of it is an investment. At first it was because I liked records, and their records looked cool and had great artwork attached to them and were a little hard to come by sometimes. But now, shit, there are Skinny Puppy records that are $500, and they're almost impossible to find. And
I don't know if I've ever owned any of their stuff on vinyl.
I started buying singles, like 12-inch singles.
Yeah.
Like I had Tormentor and a few other ones. And Spasmolytic, you know, and they always had that cool, you know, because it was Too Dark Park, and you know that time frame, all that artwork by iBrainy was so cool. So that's why I picked that up. But yeah, like, you know, the vinyl itself has now been fetishized, and then rarity and scarcity, you know, plays into that or whatever, in a way that is, you know, as soon as you have digital releases, then that just disappears. That goes away unless you're doing NFTs or something.
Yeah.
But the other weird thing is that the CDs by Skinny Puppy, some of them are stupidly expensive now because they were low production runs, or there was something weird about how the disc was produced or whatever.
Yeah, I have that Last Rites. That's messed up with them. Yeah.
We all bought Last Rites the day it came out, and it was screwed up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, then there's a whole, I mean, yeah, I guess we're way off the mark, but like there's a whole thing around, I remember trying to get like the best sound out of the computer, and then you're like, you get I forget what you call the thing, you know, it's all this back and forth between converting from analog to digital and back to analog. Like, I don't know. It's it's just another piece of it that it's related to music that is very digital and electronic.
Right.
It's kind of strange, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, in a way, they're two separate pieces. You know, there's the how it gets recorded, and then the how you listen to it. And
we really appreciate that you've been here with us for this very long ride tonight. And If you're interested in checking out more of our episodes, please go to Spotify and look for Exit 191 there. You can go to YouTube and find our YouTube channel. You can go to Facebook and look at our Facebook page. We also have a website at exit181.chaosspirals.com. That's CHAOSPIRALS.com. Thanks for being here, and we will see you again sometime real soon.